Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, here to help you fall asleep with these chilling horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so feel free to leave a comment. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. It all started. Everything I'm about to tell you happened about a year ago. During a one-week road trip in May 1993 across America, I had finally convinced my four best friends, Jake, Tony, Brian, and Kevin, and my girlfriend Emily, to join me on an epic cross-country road trip. Our main plan was to drive in 2 days from Minneapolis to Asheville, explore the vast, mysterious wilderness of the Appalachians, spend a night at an isolated, almost legendary campground deep in the woods, and then make our way back home. For weeks, we'd meticulously planned every detail, from stays at cozy motels and quaint roadside inns to spontaneous stops if we discovered something intriguing along the way. Our families and friends were thrilled for us. Even my little sister begged to come along. But with my car already bursting at the seams and her being only 8 years old while all of us were in our 20s, she stayed home. That day, we set off for Minneapolis at 5 a.m. under a brilliantly clear sky. The endless highways whisked us through various states, and the mood in the car was upbeat and carefree. We'd known each other since elementary school, and over more than a decade our friendship had solidified into a tight-knit bond. One of the best parts of traveling with old friends is that you never run out of things to talk about. Hours slipped by as we reminisced about our shared past. Yet, that same familiarity can also make you feel vulnerable. The more you care for someone, the more you unwittingly announce to the world, "I'm open, I'm exposed." And frankly, I didn't care if people thought I was quoting a book or simply repeating what others had said. It was all just part of who I was. Right at the beginning of the trip, I suggested we stop at any interesting rest stops, take short hikes on hidden nature trails, or wander along little-known paths if we spotted the right signs. Everyone was immediately on board. The idea of uncovering secret corners of our country was irresistible. We even packed swimsuits, ready to plunge into a river or pond if the chance presented itself. Everything went perfectly until we left behind the flat, familiar landscapes of the north and headed south. Soon after, veering off the scenic highway, we pulled into a dilapidated gas station in a tiny, sleepy town tucked away in the mountains of western North Carolina. The town looked almost abandoned, and the moment I stepped into that rundown station, I felt a shiver of unease. I asked Emily to stay in the car while I filled up, because something about the place unsettled me. There were a few shadowy figures meandering aimlessly down the narrow streets, and the vacant, distant looks on their faces set my nerves on edge. After leaving the gas station, we thought we were back on track on the highway, but scarcely had we resumed our drive when I noticed, on a small side road just a couple of miles before the next exit, a weathered wooden sign hanging askew. The sign was a faded brown with yellow lettering that barely read ponds. I slowed to take a closer look. As I squinted at the sign, I finally made out the full message. The spring of life feeds the forsaken ponds. Right next to it, another placard warned in grim, almost ominous script that several people had already been drawn into the vortex of this spring, and that brave cave divers attempting to explore its supposedly labyrinthine cave system had lost their lives. Even though the warning wasn't exactly comforting, it sparked an irresistible curiosity in me. I couldn't help but ask the others if we might take a detour to check out this unusual spot. Although we were all a bit exhausted, we were nearing Asheville after all, only one state away. They knew my passion for uncovering mysteries and eventually they agreed. Excitedly, I jumped out of the car, and before long we found ourselves at an abandoned gravel lot where, oddly enough, right in the middle of a stretch of gray asphalt, a murky pond lay quietly. The same old sign reappeared. Fresh spring feeds the forsaken ponds. Despite the blunt warnings below it, cautioning that one could get lost in the depths of the spring and that some had already been swallowed by its pull, the thought of the water stirred something inside me. I dove in without hesitation. For several minutes I swam in the surprisingly fresh, albeit slightly cloudy, water, while my friends watched silently from the edge. A small stream, quietly trickling from the pond into the dark forest beyond, made me wonder where it might lead. After that brief, almost ritualistic plunge into the unknown, I dried off, got back into the car, and resumed our journey. There were still about 4 hours left before we reached Asheville. But almost immediately after getting back on the road, I sensed that something was off. My friends were behaving strangely. At first, I suspected they might be upset with me for the detour, but they all insisted they were fine. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, furtive glances in the rearview mirror and lingering stares that were unusual for our typically open, candid group. Finally, I asked, "Are you guys mad at me? We've been stuck in this car for over 10 hours. No wonder anyone would get restless." They all reassured me that nothing was wrong. Then it must be me, I thought, trying to dismiss my own rising anxiety. More than once, I caught Jake's eyes in the rearview mirror giving me a strange, almost questioning look. "What's up, man?" I eventually asked him. "Nothing. Really nothing," he replied with a half-hearted laugh. "Should I take over the wheel? You seem a bit tense, like you're on edge." "No, I'm fine. I've only been driving a few hours." "Do I look exhausted?" I insisted. "No, but I do feel like you're a bit wound up." "I'm just offering to help if you need a break," he said. "I'm good. I want to keep driving," I assured him. Okay, he murmured, leaning back as if trying to relax. For about another hour, everything seemed normal, but then a sudden, overwhelming nausea washed over me, a gnawing feeling I just couldn't shake. Again and again, I felt as though my friends were watching me intently, those fleeting glances in the rearview mirror that lasted a beat too long, the kind of look you get when a friend is doing something unsettling in secret. I tried to convince myself it was just the long drive, that being in such a confined space could make anyone feel a bit odd. Yet, deep down, I couldn't help but feel that something was seriously wrong. We finally arrived in Asheville, and over the next few days, things settled down, aside from recurring bouts of inexplicable nausea. I mentioned my discomfort to the group, and together we stopped at a local pharmacy to pick up some medicine, hoping it would ease the unsettling feeling. Up until then, I'd chalked up the odd looks to the closeness that comes from spending so many hours together. In hindsight, that might have been partly true, but during the drive, I couldn't shake the impression that they were, consciously or unconsciously, observing me. On the fourth day, we set up camp at an old, slightly run-down campground just a few miles from a mysterious marshland in the heart of the Appalachian woods, a place shrouded in eerie legends passed down through generations. That evening, my nausea became so intense that I nearly lost control, while my friends, thankfully, seemed perfectly normal. Inside a spacious tent that could hold 6 people, we soon settled in for the night. Eventually, only Jake and I remained awake, exchanging memories of days gone by. At midnight, out of nowhere, Jake turned to me with unmistakable irritation. "Why do you keep doing that?" he demanded. "What do you mean?" I asked, taken aback as his tone stung. In an exaggerated, theatrical gesture, he thrust his hand so forcefully into his mouth that his wrist nearly grazed his lips. "Today, you've done it twice already. It's disgusting. Cut it out." I stared at my hand in disbelief, then met his gaze. "What are you talking about?" "I'm just joking around. It's supposed to be funny." "I'm serious," Jake snapped, his voice growing sharper and more frustrated. "You keep putting your fingers in your mouth these past few days and making these weird gestures. Even Emily hasn't said a word. How is that possible?" Then he burst out laughing when he saw the shock on my face. "It's not even that bad. It's just gross." Fuming, I retorted, "I don't do that. My hand hasn't even touched my mouth today." "You're acting like you're completely out of your mind," he scoffed. "Go to sleep. If you keep this up, tomorrow I'll just cook eggs for you instead of catching your germs." With that, he settled back down and whispered, "Good night, man." I was left angry and confused. Something about Jake's intensity felt off, as if he was seeing something I couldn't. A growing sense of unease tugged at me, so I quietly slipped out of the tent to get some fresh air and clear my head. Under the starry night sky, I looked up for a moment and suddenly the nausea struck again. I hurried back to the car, switched on the interior light, and adjusted the rearview mirror so I could catch my own reflection, hoping it might offer some answers. In that moment, I felt an eerie chill, a rising wave of nausea, and a mounting nervousness. As I stared into the mirror watching my own face, something bizarre happened. My lips began to twist involuntarily into a strange, almost forced smile, as if I were amused by something. Slowly, my mouth opened, and to my horror, I saw my hand inching toward my lips, as though it were trying to feed itself in, centimeter by centimeter. Startled, I jerked it away violently. I was horrified, staring at my unmoving hand, wondering if I was really half asleep. Was it a nightmare? Yet everything felt disturbingly real. I didn't wake up that night. Instead, I was trapped in that eerie state of half-wakefulness. Once I managed to collect myself, I sprinted back to the tent, unzipped it in a frenzy, crawled inside, and quickly zipped it up. I was wide awake now, but my stomach rebelled, and I felt as if I were about to vomit at any moment. My frantic movements eventually woke Emily and one of my friends. "What's wrong?" Emily whispered, gently stroking my back. "I'm nauseous. I'm scared," I stammered, my whole body trembling. Emily sat up and, using her lantern, cast a warm glow inside the tent. But in the few silent seconds that followed, I thought I heard my name whispered softly. "Hey," Emily said, shaking my shoulder gently. "Hey!" I cried out in panic, and suddenly everyone in the tent was wide awake. "What's going on?" Someone asked anxiously. Someone just called my name," I gasped. For a few agonizing seconds, a ghostly silence fell over us as we stared at one another in mute horror. Then, through a small, unlatched opening in the tent, I caught sight of a huge, glowing eye. An enormous, unblinking gaze that shone into the tent with an unnatural brightness. It glittered menacingly. Suddenly, a long, shadowy arm burst through the tent fabric with unbridled force, flailing wildly. I was thrown to the ground as my stomach twisted in a violent knot. I began retching uncontrollably as something massive coiled down my neck. I heard a dreadful ripping sound, as if something were being torn from me. Strangely, at that very moment, the overwhelming nausea vanished, replaced by a bizarre sense of relief. The tent collapsed around us, and the last thing seared into my mind was the image of that sparkling, ominous eye. At some point during that seemingly endless night, police officers pulled me from the wreckage of the collapsed tent. I can't say how long it took before other campers realized that something utterly unimaginable had occurred. Later, the authorities discovered the mutilated remains of my friends scattered across the campground. To this day, people claim that a wild boar was responsible for the horror. A ludicrous explanation meant to account for the unthinkable. No one would believe my story. My experiences were dismissed as nothing more than a nightmare, and everyone spoke of trauma as if the indescribable terror I had endured could somehow be neatly explained away. I miss my friends and Emily beyond words. I loved them all so deeply, I should have never set foot at that cursed pond. Something in that water, in that mysterious corner of the Appalachian woods, left a permanent mark on me. I'm convinced that in that moment, something happened that changed me forever. It was when I was driving through the vast golden fields of the Kansas prairie that my life began to unravel. I was on my way to visit my parents in a small town in Iowa. The fastest route took me along Interstate 35 heading south, a journey that was supposed to take exactly 14 hours. Naturally, I'd packed plenty of snacks and drinks to avoid frequent stops. I simply can't stand stretching an already endless-seeming drive with constant interruptions. Some of you might be thinking, why didn't you just fly? But anyone who grew up in America knows that when traveling domestically, especially to a little town, driving is the norm. Now, after everything that happened, I wish I'd chosen to fly. A mistake that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was cruising on an especially deserted stretch of highway. There wasn't a single other vehicle in sight, not even on the opposing lane. Accustomed to the occasional solitude on American country roads, I let a podcast draw me into a sort of highway hypnosis. I can't even recall much of what the podcast said. Before I knew it, the monotonous drive had lulled me into a trance-like state. I don't know how long I'd been driving in that state or what snapped me out of it. The only thing I knew was that suddenly, something wasn't right. As always, I checked my usual indicators. My cell phone still had full reception and my gas tank was nearly full. Those two certainties had always gotten me through moments like these before, so at first I dismissed it as mere imagination. But then something crucial struck me. For minutes now, I hadn't seen a single other vehicle. At first, that didn't seem threatening. It was, after all, a remote stretch of road. But it was odd. On a Saturday afternoon in the middle of nowhere, I'd normally expect to see at least a few cars passing by. My mind assured me that it was perfectly normal and that I would soon spot someone. Maybe I'd just missed the few vehicles that occasionally pass. Then I noticed something else was amiss. Not a single exit, no roadside billboards, and, upon closer inspection, there wasn't even 1 mile marker to mark the distance. A wave of dread washed over me. My stomach clenched, and my mind began sending red warning signals. I grabbed my cell phone, mounted on the dashboard, and switched to the navigation app I always kept running in the background, just to check the remaining time and distance. A small dopamine boost to help me endure the monotonous drive. But when I looked at the app, all I saw was an uninterrupted, straight line. No remaining time, no distance indicator, not even a street name. I slowed down, turned on my hazard lights, and tried pinching out on the display to zoom out for an overview. But no matter how far I zoomed, it was the same endless line. It couldn't be that I was no longer on Interstate 35. It made no sense that I wasn't seeing other drivers. No signs, no exits, no landmarks. Just endless fields of sunlit golden wheat. To be sure, I got out of the car and looked around. I stepped lightly onto the asphalt, which still looked familiar, dismissing the thought that my phone might have just momentarily lost signal. A quick glance at the top right corner of the screen confirmed full reception, completely normal. A million thoughts raced through my head, some rational, others less so. I closed the app and reopened it, only to be startled by a pop-up I'd never seen before: no GPS connection. I immediately checked my location services. They had been on since the start of my drive, untouched. Yet my phone couldn't determine my location. Growing increasingly unsettled, I dialed my mother's number. With every ring, my heart pounded faster until, finally, I heard her familiar voice. We talked for a while as I explained what was happening. She just laughed and said, "You know, out there it's notoriously empty, and these phones act up all the time. Your generation relies on them too much." I rolled my eyes internally, though I had to admit she might be right. Perhaps it was just a server outage with the GPS app, an explanation that sounded perfectly plausible in our everyday routine. I promised her I'd call again as soon as I got closer, said goodbye, and told her how much I loved her dot back in the driver's seat. Another unsettling detail came back to me. No exits. Sure, in the midst of this seemingly deserted landscape that might be possible. No billboards, unusual perhaps, but not unthinkable in remote stretches. Yet no mile markers at all. My mind insisted that maybe time was dragging in my panic, so the missing markers were merely an illusion. Reluctantly, I continued driving, this time watching the odometer intently. 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15. And finally, after 80 miles, not a single marker appeared. I pulled over, checked my phone, which thankfully still had full reception, and called out, "Mom, it's me again. No, I'm not getting any closer to my destination. Don't laugh, but I'm really scared. Would it be crazy to call the highway patrol? Maybe they should be on the lookout for my car. I'll call back later. Goodbye. I love you, Mom." I immediately contacted the highway patrol. They dispatched someone promptly, even though I was sure I sounded pretty crazy. A friendly officer answered and asked which mile marker I was at. I explained that I hadn't seen a single mile marker in over 80 miles. Then she asked for the last town I remembered passing. "Malvern," I replied. She then instructed me to stay right where I was and keep the hazard lights on. After I gave her the make and model of my car, she hung up. For a moment, I just stared out at the endless expanse. A landscape without hills, without trees, without shrubs, eerily barren. Restless, I called my mother again and recounted every detail. We talked for what felt like hours, about my impending arrival, about mundane things, even about a little drama at her repair shop. Anything to frame this bizarre situation in familiar terms. Our conversation went on until, suddenly, the highway patrol called back. What the officer said next sent my fear soaring to unimaginable heights. While I gazed out at the cloudless, blue sky with the sun high overhead, it was still that same Saturday afternoon, she calmly said, "We're calling off the search for tonight, as darkness and an approaching storm are expected. If you need further assistance, please call us back." I hung up and sat in heavy silence. Darkness. A storm. In this sun-drenched landscape at this time of day, such things were inconceivable. After a hesitant moment, I restarted the engine. The dashboard clock read 9:37 a.m., and I still had half a tank left, the little orange needle wobbling as I contemplated my next move. I decided to keep driving, but not any further in that mysterious direction. With a heavy heart, I switched to drive mode, merged over the grassy median into the oncoming lane, and earnestly hoped to find my familiar way back. I pressed on as if nothing were amiss until my music was suddenly interrupted by the ringtone of an incoming call. It was my father. He told me it was nearly 10 a.m. and described how hysterical my mother was, how the highway patrol couldn't locate me. He asked what I was doing, what my surroundings looked like, if there were any notable landmarks. "There's nothing," I replied bluntly. "The sun is unmoved and the road runs perfectly straight. No curves, no bumps. There are no signs, no animals, not even a cloud in the sky, no rocky outcrops or solitary trees. Just endless, barren fields, 2 parallel gray asphalt lanes, and me." I mentioned that my gas was nearly empty and joked that he should send me a refill, but my worry grew as his usually cheerful voice had lost all its lightness. We talked a while longer. He reminisced about my childhood, my first baseball game, the first time he took me to work. His voice brimmed with pride, and as he recalled those moments, tears welled in my eyes. So moved was I by the realization of how far I'd come in life. My throat tightened, and I had to pull over because the emotions nearly overwhelmed me. Shortly after, my mother answered the call. In a warm, almost tearful tone, she recounted every little, loving detail of the day I was born. The exact time, my birth weight, what she'd had for breakfast that morning, and how difficult the delivery had been. She emphasized, over and over, just how priceless I was to her. I could hear her sniffle as she told me she loved me, and I could only stutter. The words stuck in my throat. I told them I'd call back soon after gathering my thoughts. Then I drove on until the little orange needle on the fuel gauge hit E, that unmistakable sign of empty fuel. I let the remaining miles roll by until my car finally came to a stop. I sat there, absent-mindedly nibbling on a granola bar I'd packed, and soon drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke, the sun was mercilessly scorching overhead, and the car was so oppressively hot I nearly overheated. I sought refuge in a small patch of shade beside the vehicle. At that moment, I fixed my gaze on the asphalt and scrutinized every detail, every crack, every uneven spot. It was as if not a single ant, fly, or insect existed in that dead silence. I gathered all the food and drinks I had brought, stowed them in one of my duffel bags, along with the clothes I no longer needed, and slung it over my shoulder. On foot, I set out, realizing that I had to seize this final chance to warn anyone who might take the same road. My cell phone, still at 100% battery and plugged in, was my only lifeline. Deep down, I knew that once this device died, all contact with the outside world would vanish. Before it finally went dead, I wanted to call everyone I could think of. I wanted to say goodbye, to forgive those I could, and hope that I would be forgiven. Perhaps this would be a more dignified end than most receive, and maybe it would give my loved one some semblance of closure. But I couldn't let my mother blame herself and spend the rest of her life in endless sorrow. So I called her once more and told her I'd found an oasis, cool water, countless animals to hunt, and shady trees offering protection. I assured her I was alive and safe, even if we might never see each other again. As I spoke those almost fairy tale words, I stared once more into that endless void. We both knew we were lying, but neither of us dared to admit it. At that point, I was certain my end was near. Would I slowly waste away from hunger or thirst, or would I find a way to hasten my fate? Would I cling to the last spark of life, chewing on the barren prairie grass until malnutrition finally overtook me? I didn't know. My bewildered mind wanted to debate as if I still had choices. Yet, deep down, I knew this path would inexorably lead to my end. I didn't want to know where this damned road ultimately led, but I knew exactly where it would finish for me. And so I write these lines as I sit in the middle of this deserted road, so far away that even my car has long since vanished into the endless expanse. I eat the last rations of my supplies and leave you with one final warning. Never take this road. Do not enter it. It leads into nothingness. And if you do decide to follow it, pray that you don't end up where I have ended. To all who knew me, farewell. After finally graduating from high school, I knew exactly how I wanted to spend my gap year before I sold my soul to college for the next 4 to 6 years. I had planned an epic cross-country road trip, from the Atlantic coast all the way to the towering Rockies, crisscrossing the nation. I envisioned simply climbing into my old car, cranking up the engine, and letting the highways and backroads decide my fate. My parents were initially against the idea. They were worried I might end up disappearing into the wild, just like in that movie, Into the Wild. But I promised them, with all the conviction I could muster, that I'd return safe and sound after my grand adventure. Eventually, they relented and even lent me an emergency fund of about $5,000 in case something unexpected happened along the way. I wasn't planning on spending much on fancy accommodations anyway. I wanted the experience to be as raw and immersive as possible, so I intended to sleep in my car. I said goodbye to my parents, punched Aspen, Colorado into my GPS, started the engine, and set off with a suitcase full of clothes, a backpack loaded with books and snacks, and a head full of longing to discover who I truly was on the open road. Now, I could regale you with countless tales from my travels across America. Stories of nights spent in the misty Appalachian foothills, like the time I witnessed a raccoon and a fox squabble over an old chunk of cheese. Or that surreal moment in the Midwest when I was convinced I'd seen a forest spirit. Or even the episode along the Mississippi where two guys floated by on a makeshift raft, straight out of a modern-day Huckleberry Finn. But you're not here for those. You want to hear about the mansion I stumbled upon during that terrifying winter storm. I left the Northeast at the end of August, with the last warm days of summer fading behind me. My plan was to reach the Rockies before the snow started to fall. Along the way, I took my time, stopping at lonely rest areas for days on end, reading books, soaking my feet in small lakes and streams, and savoring the unbridled freedom. But nature had other plans. While I was driving through an endless, flat stretch of Midwestern farmland, the first snow began to fall. Subtle at first, then rapidly intensifying by mid-October. As the snowfall picked up pace, I decided to pull over at the next rest area and wait out the storm. Unfortunately, that spot was already packed with long-haul truckers, all apparently sharing the same bright idea. I wasn't bothered by their presence. I have immense respect for truck drivers and the hardships they endure on the road. So I opted to keep moving, hoping to find a less crowded refuge soon. I was glad I'd just filled up my tank. With the heater on and bundled up in a heavy winter coat, one I only had thanks to my mother's insistence, I continued driving. At first, everything seemed normal, until the snow turned into a full-blown blizzard. My phone vibrated, alerting me through a weather app of extreme black ice ahead. My car, an old family relic from my uncle, was hardly in its prime even on good days. With its worn tires, I was definitely out of my depth in a blizzard. I was thankful there wasn't much traffic. My car kept sliding into the next lane, and I was relieved that I wasn't endangering anyone. Eventually, I pulled over fully to the right, left the engine running, and frantically wondered what to do next. According to my GPS, the next rest area was still about 20 miles away. A breeze in fair weather, but in this whiteout it was like a suicide run. Stopping on the side risked being buried in snow later, or having a snowplow cover my car with even more drifts. I was left with two extremely unattractive options: fight my way through the storm, or wait here indefinitely. In the end, I made the worst decision, as it turned out. I turned on my hazard lights, slowly inched forward at a snail's pace, telling myself that if it got any worse, I could always pull over again. But after just a few hundred yards at barely 10 miles per hour, I began to seriously doubt my judgment. My headlights barely illuminated a few yards ahead, and I could scarcely tell whether I was on the road or in a ditch. Then, without warning, something darted across the road. I assumed it was a deer. It burst straight through my beam of light, and in a panic, I jerked the steering wheel. My car went into a wild skid. The worn tires lost all grip, and with a deafening crash, I slid off the roadway. My car ended up half on a small overpass spanning a creek and half teetering over the edge. I came to with my face pressed against the airbag. The impact had triggered the airbags, and luckily they saved me from far worse injuries. I gingerly ran my hand over my body. Just a few bruises, sore ribs, and some shallow cuts on my face. All in all, I was lucky. On the downside, my car was completely done. The heater was dead, the battery had clearly taken a beating, and outside the storm raged on. "Damn it!" I hissed, as I freed myself from the seatbelt and felt the brutal cold seeping through the shattered window. I reached into my backpack, which normally held a ton of books, but then remembered the separate bag my father always lovingly called emergency gear. To my relief, I found a small shovel and 2 red emergency flares. "Thanks, Dad," I murmured through chattering lips. A quick glance at my phone revealed no signal. I had offline maps, but they were useless if I didn't know how to get out of this mess. On a whim, I dialed 911, but the connection was so poor that all I heard was unintelligible static. By now, I was trembling all over despite the layers of sweaters in my coat. I tried to convince myself that maybe a snowplow would pass by, or that I could use one of the flares to signal for help. The cold crept relentlessly into every fiber of my being, and I was so exhausted that I nearly nodded off, when suddenly there was a knock on the window. Peering through the fogged glass, I recognized a figure bundled in a thick jacket. Overwhelmed with relief, I almost reached out to embrace her. When I opened the door, the wind roared in, drowning out any attempt at conversation. The stranger pointed to a pickup truck parked a short distance away and made it clear that I should get in. Grabbing my 2 backpacks, I stumbled through the blowing snow after her. Barely had I settled into the passenger seat when a wave of comforting, warm air enveloped me. I pressed my numb hands against the vents, desperate for heat. At the wheel sat a middle-aged woman, perhaps in her early 50s, who looked more like a strict schoolteacher than a saving angel. Still, I was immeasurably grateful. Thank you so much," I stammered through chattering teeth. "I almost veered off the road because of a deer, and, well, my car's stuck." She gave a brief nod, looking exhausted and strangely distant, then pointed out through the windshield into the darkness. "You're lucky you crashed so close to the estate of my employer," she said in an oddly robotic tone. "I'll take you there so you can warm up. What we do next is up to Mr. Hardin." With that, she engaged the gears and navigated her truck confidently over the deep snow. After a while, I noticed barbed wire fences along the roadside. The woman, whose name I still didn't know, asked me to remain in the truck, stepped out, and disappeared into the swirling snow. When she returned, she drove through a gate in the fence that she must have opened herself. The storm raged on, yet she seemed to know exactly where she was headed. After several minutes on a rough, almost unpaved road, a massive mansion emerged before us, more like an old manor from another era. Who owns all this? According to my GPS, there should be a wildlife refuge around here, I remarked, staring at the imposing silhouette. She coolly replied, "This is the estate of Mr. James Hardin. With some luck, he'll allow you to stay here until the storm subsides." Sighing, she turned off the engine and motioned for me to get out. I knew my ribs were already screaming in pain at the mere thought of moving. My rescuer noticed my grimace. "I'm Elaine. I'm Mr. Hardin's private nurse. Let's get inside first. I need to assess your injuries," she said as she stepped out. I gathered my backpacks, unbuckled my seatbelt, and trudged into the lashing snow, my left side feeling like it was on fire. The moment I shut the massive front door behind me, a wave of relief washed over me. Inside, it was cozy and warm. My eyes roamed over the grand foyer where lavish paintings, mostly landscapes and portraits in heavy gold frames, adorned the walls. On pedestals stood ancient vases reminiscent of Greek or Roman antiquities. I carefully set my 2 backpacks down on the smooth, polished floor and took a deep breath. "Like I said, I'm Elaine. Mr. Hardin is my patient," the woman repeated as she helped me peel off my soaking jacket. "And what's your name?" "Nathan," I replied. At that moment, a second woman appeared, clearly a housekeeper. Her gaze was as strangely vacant as Elaine's, yet she seemed even more impassive, almost like a machine dutifully performing her task. "Did you bring someone new in?" she asked in a monotone. "Yes, Johanna. Otherwise, he would have frozen, and it looks like he injured his ribs," Elaine explained as she guided me to a padded armchair. I sank into it, gasping as a sharp pain shot through me. Elaine lifted my shirt and inhaled audibly. Beneath it were large blue bruises where the seatbelt had held me in place. Johanna offered no expression, simply stepping out of the room to fetch something. "Do you think you can get up, Nathan?" Elaine asked kindly, helping me to my feet. She supported me as she led me down a long, carpet-lined corridor to a room with an old wooden bed that looked surprisingly inviting. "Please take off your shirt. I need to listen to your chest," she said as she helped me sit down. I obeyed, gritting my teeth as a stethoscope touched my aching ribs. "You're lucky in misfortune. It's probably just a broken rib. For a definitive diagnosis, an X-ray would be ideal, but with this weather, no ambulance can get here. You'll have to stay until the storm subsides. Then, I'll consult with Mr. Hardin about what to do next," she explained. I nodded briefly in thanks, relieved to be in a safe haven. She handed me 2 painkillers and a glass of water. "Take these. They'll make the pain more bearable. I'll be right back with some ice and bandages." Once she left the room, I lifted my shirt and began rummaging through my backpack for a book, hoping to distract myself. But my thoughts kept returning to this strange, eerie place. After a while, I heard the sound of wheels and looked up. In the doorway stood an antique wheelchair carved from dark wood, and in it sat a gaunt figure, his face half concealed by a silver metal mask. He coughed hoarsely and appeared fragile, almost deathly pale. I struggled to stand, suspecting it might be Mr. Hardin himself. "Visitors are rare in this house." Especially at this time of year, came a strangely metallic voice, as if coming through a synthetic system. I cleared my throat. Hello. I was in a car accident, and Elaine brought me here before I froze to death." He gave a slight nod, or at least it seemed so, then gasped, "Yes, that was lucky misfortune." Beside him stood Johanna, the housekeeper, with an equally detached, almost emotionless look. "It's just a pity we can't offer you a better room," he said in an eerily modulated tone. It almost sounded like he was mocking me, but his face remained hidden behind the mask. Johanna leaned in and whispered something I couldn't quite understand. Then he continued, "Rest. Elaine will take care of you. Later, at dinner, we shall meet again." No sooner had he spoken than Johanna wheeled the chair out of the room. I took a deep breath, feeling my bruised ribs throb in pain. After a few minutes, Elaine returned with a bowl of ice and a bandage. She helped stabilize my chest and applied a cold compress to the swollen area. "Do you feel any better now?" she asked. I nodded. "Can I ask, what's wrong with Mr. Hardin? I mean, he wears a mask and speaks in such a strange way." She raised a hand to stop me. "His affliction is genetic, something that has plagued his family for generations. If you want to know more, ask him at dinner. And please, just call him Mr. Hardin, all right?" "Sure, but what am I supposed to wear?" I managed a pained laugh as the band around my ribs throbbed with every movement. "My clothes are in my suitcase in the car, and I'm not exactly in a position to get them now." Elaine smiled, a warmth I hadn't seen from her before. "Johanna will fetch you some suitable clothes, don't worry about it." And with that, she vanished again. I lost track of time, but when I went to the window and looked out into the raging blizzard, I noticed something disturbing. Crudely carved into the wooden windowsill were the words, "Save me." I stood there, frozen, wondering if someone here was playing a macabre joke or if it was a genuine cry for help. Suddenly, I heard the doorknob move. I dashed over to my backpack and clutched the small shovel I had kept handy in my panic, but then I heard Johanna's voice. "It's me, Johanna. I've got some clothes for you." I stepped back, quickly set the shovel aside, and opened the door. Johanna entered with that familiar, slightly absent-minded smile and handed me a few antiquated-looking garments. One of the white shirts bore a large, dark stain, as if something had dried on it. For a brief moment she paled, then quickly hid the shirt behind her back and grinned apologetically. "Oh, that one must be a stained piece that got mixed up. Just take the others." She offered no further explanation and hurried right back out. A chill ran through me. Something about this place was horribly off. I locked the door again, wedged a chair under the knob, and carefully changed into the clothes Johanna had left. Though old-fashioned, they fit reasonably well. I tried to rest, but my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. I stole another glance at the windowsill. The carved words, "Save me," were unmistakable. My instincts screamed to leave immediately, but in this blizzard, where could I possibly go? Eventually, Johanna knocked again and led me into a grand dining hall, where Mr. Hardin was already seated at the head of a long wooden table. On the table, several silver serving platters with lids promised a lavish meal. My stomach growled. I hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days. "Mr. Hardin, may I introduce our guest, Nathan?" Johanna said in her mechanical tone. "Please, have a seat." She pulled out a chair for me, and I slowly took my place. Under the serving lids emerged a steaming roast, accompanied by vegetables and freshly baked rolls. The aroma was mouth-watering, and for a moment, my hunger made me forget where I was. Mr. Hardin himself, however, had no plate before him. "Aren't you going to eat, Mr. Hardin?" I asked timidly as I began to carve the roast. The meat was strange, reminiscent of game, yet with a texture I couldn't quite place. He responded with a mechanical wheeze, as if coming from an old machine. "I can't eat normally because of my condition. I'd rather spare you the sight." As he spoke, saliva dribbled from beneath his mask, which Elaine quickly wiped away. Uneasy, I let my gaze wander around the room until I stopped before a monumental painting. A portrait of an ancestor dressed in an old military uniform, also wearing a mask, but far more ornate. "An ancestor of yours, Mr. Hardin?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Carl Hardin, wounded in the Civil War. The family is old and cursed by their legacy." He coughed harshly, and once again saliva trickled from beneath his mask. I felt increasingly uncomfortable. Suddenly, the sumptuous meal, as delicious as it smelled, began to taste oddly heavy. I tried to make small talk, asking why he lived in such a remote manor far from any major city, but his voice was so fragile that before he could answer, Elaine interjected. "Mr. Hardin is exhausted now. We should end dinner. He needs his rest." With that, she wheeled the chair out of the dining hall. Johanna collected the used dishes, offering me a strangely distorted smile as I struggled painfully to stand, mindful of my injured ribs. I made my way back to my room, closed and locked the door behind me. Outside, the icy wind battered the window shutters, and the old wooden beams creaked intermittently. Exhausted, I sank onto the bed. My eyes drifted to the words "Save me" carved into the windowsill. I traced the letters with my fingers, and a fleeting thought passed through me. That I wasn't the first person trapped in this cursed house. When I finally opened the closet to look for some sort of pajamas, I noticed additional carvings in the wood, words like "monster" and "help me." And wedged in one of the grooves was a broken fingernail. It looked unmistakably human. Panic gripped me, and in that moment, I heard someone rattle the doorknob. It was Johanna again. "I brought you some pajamas," she said, her tone almost mocking. With a keyring that could open any door in the house, she unlocked the door. I quickly ducked behind it, gripping a reamer from a tire repair kit, bracing myself. When she found the right key, she stepped in and laid a neatly folded set of clothes on the bed. Although she almost appeared friendly, her smile was off. She didn't notice that I was clenching something behind my back. Then she flatly said, "Good night," and closed the door behind her. I immediately relocked the door and wedged a chair under the knob, anything to feel a modicum of safety. But that safety was an illusion. Outside, the storm still raged, and inside, a storm of paranoia brewed. Around 3:40 a.m., as I was drifting toward sleep, a persistent scratching awoke me. Someone, or something, was knocking at the door. Then came a violent thudding, as if someone was trying to force their way in. For a moment, I held my breath, clutched the shovel tightly. With a sinister creak, the lock suddenly broke. A heavy blow struck the hinges, and the door crashed down along with a chair and splintered wood onto the floor. "Nathan," a distorted voice moaned in the darkness. To my horror, I saw Mr. Hardin, only now he was crawling on all fours like an insect. Or rather, he had 6 spindly limbs protruding from his body. His mask was askew, and from his lower jaw emerged a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth. A scream tore from my throat as I yanked one of the emergency flares from my backpack and tried desperately to light it. But before I could, he was upon me, striking with bony claws. Drooling fluid dripped from his gaping mouth. In pure desperation, I rammed my left arm into his maw to block his bite, and an infernal pain shot through me as his teeth sank into my flesh. Finally, I managed to ignite the flare and thrust its blazing flames into his neck. He howled, and a grotesque brown fluid oozed out as I simultaneously drove my makeshift metal spike into the same gash. With a cry of pain, he recoiled, and I pulled myself up, limping toward the door. Outside in the hallway, I encountered Johanna carrying a stack of fresh linens. She dropped them in shock when she saw me in my battered state, and behind me, Mr. Hardin advanced in a grotesque, contorted manner. Before she could react, he lunged like a berserker, tearing her apart and devouring her alive. I seized the opportunity, stumbling to the staircase and climbing up through searing pain in my chest, only to find that every door was locked. Behind me, I heard the creaking and hissing of his approach, and I caught fragments of a voice echoing, "Run, little rabbit, run." Finally, I spotted a door that wasn't locked. I pushed it open, quickly locked it behind me, and dashed into an empty room devoid of any furniture I could use as a barricade. Desperate, I hurled my backpack through the window. The glass shattered with a deafening clamor as icy gusts slammed against me, and I heard him breaking through the door outside. With every ounce of strength left, I leapt through the broken window into the several-foot-deep snow. I felt 100,000 needles of cold piercing my skin, but adrenaline drove me to crawl forward. The raging snowstorm swallowed every sound, even the enraged screams of that monstrous creature. As I groped around in near-zero visibility, I managed to activate my last flare. Its ghostly red light danced over the swirling snow. Then, suddenly, I heard a loud crash behind me. Panicked, I turned and saw the creature, once Mr. Hardin, crawling across the snow. Without hesitation, I stumbled deeper into the white nothingness until I tripped over a frozen clump of earth. The flare slipped from my grasp and lodged, still smoldering, in the snow. I heard the cracking and wheezing of his approach once again, but then he stopped. He sniffed audibly, emitting a series of clicking sounds, as if trying to echolocate me. It seemed he was blind, or perhaps unable to see in the furious snowstorm. He hissed several times, "Nathan," and crawled off in the wrong direction. My heart pounded as I lay motionless in the snow, on the verge of losing consciousness to the bitter cold. After what felt like an eternity, the creature finally vanished into the roaring white. I dragged myself on, step by painful step, until I finally reached a country road. My lips were blue, my fingers numb, and I could barely feel my feet. I managed a few more yards before everything went black and I collapsed lifelessly in the snow. It wasn't long before a snowplow truck found me, half frozen and teetering on the edge of death. I eventually regained consciousness in a hospital. The doctors had barely managed to save my life, but my frostbite was so severe that I lost several fingers and toes. My broken ribs required extensive treatment as well. When I recounted what had happened, the police listened politely, but dismissed my story as hallucinations brought on by the near-fatal accident and severe hypothermia. My parents arrived immediately, and we cut my road trip short. Needless to say, I was too shocked to continue. Since that night, I've tried desperately not to think about Mr. Hardin and his grotesque secret. I suffer from nightmares, though I tell myself that sometimes the mind plays cruel tricks on you. Then, not long ago, I received an unmarked package. Inside, to my dismay, was that very backpack full of books I had used to break the window, and a small, accusing note. "Run, rabbit, run.